Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Abi Ishola. This week, the streets were filled in places like Trinidad, Haiti, and Brazil with revelers celebrating Carnival. In New Orleans, crowds came out for Mardi Gras. On this edition of Independent Sources, we look at what makes these events big news for the ethnic media and why the festivities make the financial as well as front pages. We talked to a veteran journalist who is blogging about unrest in the Caribbean. We commemorate Black History Month with a filmmaker who has chronicled the mission of the Black press. And we profile a paper with the mission to publish positive news. But first, Independent Sources host Garry Pierre-Pierre recently sat down with journalist Slater. They talked about the culture of Carnival and the effect finances can have on the fun.
Slater, you've been involved in covering Carnival and participating in other ways, Carnival in New York and the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago. Mm-hmm. Now tell me, we often think of Carnival as 3 days leading to Ash Wednesday. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more than that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, it starts, if you talk to the band, people who produce the Carnival bands, they will tell you it starts right after the last Carnival, ended. It's a long process, and the events, the official events leading into the Carnival, I would say get going maybe about a month before, in Trinidad I'm talking about specifically, about a month before with the different dances, the big fetes that they have, and coming down closer to the actual 2 Carnival days, which is the Monday and Tuesday before Ash Wednesday, you have any number of competitions, the steel band competition, the calypso competition, the costume competitions, and so on. And then it all winds up with the parade, of course, on the streets for those 2 days of Carnival.
And what happens when this parade? Is this like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, or what is it?
Well, we don't like to say, when you say parade, as a matter of fact, I recall that in the early days of the Labor Day exercise in Brooklyn.
Exercise,
when we called it a carnival, there were others who were saying parade, and therein lies the difference, because it's not a parade in that kind of way.
Well, tell us what it is in Trinidad, for instance.
In Trinidad, it's people getting together in groups, organized carnival bands, masquerade bands, to portray a particular theme, and that is something that takes place, as I said, it takes lots of planning in the time period before Carnival.
And it's usually neighborhood groups, and how are these groups form?
It's not as much neighborhood as it used to be.
Like
Carnival, like everything else, has evolved. And so you have, for instance, a large influx of people from abroad coming now to play, foreigners coming now to play, in the Carnival thing. So whereas in earlier years, back in the 40s and 50s and so on, you had that neighborhood thing, especially with the steel bands, when they became, a prominent force in the Carnival. It was very much of a community type thing. Now, community involvement is kind of very much reduced, because you have bands that have people from all over.
Interesting point, because let's talk about the foreigner, and sometimes not really foreigners, but Trinidadians and other Caribbean going to back home, and what kind of economic impact do they contribute to these local economies?
Well, it's tremendous. I mean, there's no event that attracts as many people in terms of Trinidad and Tobago. Remember that Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, is not a tourism-driven, economy. So that in spite of the fact that there's that petro dollars thing that's going in Trinidad, fortunately for them, all year round, at Carnival time, hotels are booked. For the first time in the recent years, you're having now a building boom in hotels in Trinidad and Tobago, which is something that was not very much a part of the whole scene for many years, But they've seen now the need to do that. And obviously there's just people catering to people for Carnival wouldn't, that wouldn't pay the bills, and so on. But for Carnival, you have hotels booked to a level that they never are for the rest of the year.
And I'm sure rental cars and restaurants,
everything else, the whole shebang, or everything else that's related to that activity.
Okay.
You know, it's very difficult to get space. You know, people will rent out their homes, you know, for visitors and whatnot. So the economic impact is tremendous.
Earlier, we talked about what is Carnival. One of the aspects of Carnival is that this is a political satire, times for people to, you know, break social taboos. What happens in Trinidad? How does that manifest itself during Carnival?
Well, they always talk about it as the great equalizer, you know, because it's where everyone becomes one.
There's no class.
There's no class. There's no class distinction. I have to kind of backtrack a little bit on that, because in some of the groups, you know, I would say that you can see a kind of social gathering, you know, of sorts, in that folks who are of a particular ilk might want to, if you see a particular band that is headed by someone of, you know, a particular ethnic group or something, you might tend to see more of that group, you know, as part of that band. But generally speaking, there is no, you know, disparity between the one and, you know, and the other. Everyone feels, as long as you go and you see the costumes displayed, and you figure you want to pay this amount of money to play in that particular costume, you're free to do so.
How much does that cost roughly to play in a
Well, you know, it has gotten to be quite large now as opposed to what it used to be, obviously. I mean, you know, we're talking Trinidad dollars. Maybe in terms of American dollars, you could be talking 600 American dollars.
Okay, wow,
you know,
that's a lot of money.
To play, of course, you know, to play in something. Not all of them would be that expensive, but some, you know, would be $200 maybe, or $4 or something like that. But in a good, the larger bands, that's generally the kind of price range that you're talking about. You know?
You know, Carnival obviously doesn't happen only in Trinidad. Trinidad is really like probably the most popular, famous in the Caribbean. But we have Haiti, we have Brazil, we have New Orleans. What are some of the different ways that these places celebrate Carnival, if you will?
Well, I was privileged one year to be in the New Orleans thing, back quite a while back ago, back in the 70s. And, you know, that is really parade. You know, I mean, that is quintessentially a parade. Brazil, I think that Trinidad aped Brazil quite a bit, you know, in more recent years, in the late part of the 20th century. In the 1980s and stuff, you saw the Trinidad costumes starting to very much resemble Brazilian costumes. You know, the women scantily clad and all that. And I guess that's one of the reasons for the visitors, especially male visitors, going there. You know, but in Trinidad, it used to be a whole lot of creativity, you know, that you saw manifested in terms of the making of the costumes. You know, in Brazil, it's that too, because there's a thematic thing as well in the Brazil Carnival. You know, but it's I think generally speaking, I would say the communal you know, spirit, you know, that Carnival is manifested in all of them.
We have our own Carnival in New York. It's not celebrated during the Lent season. It's Labor Day.
For practical reasons.
Yes, it's because it's not cold weather-wise.
Yeah.
So for our viewers who have never seen it, can you tell us what it's like?
Well, the Labor Day Carnival is very much takes its pattern from the Trinidad Carnival, I would say. The same idea of groups, you know, getting together to portray a particular theme and so on is what you have here. You have steel bands involved in it as you are in the Trinidad Carnival. But here, because of a totally different culture that you're part of and a whole different system, you know, the parade thing is what again it becomes to the fore. You know, it's a carnival, but
it's a melange of carnival and parade and political.
Right. You know, you can't. In other words, you are in New York. You cannot do your own thing. You know what I mean? You have to conform to what New York.
Heavy police presence.
There you go.
Control.
There you go. There you go.
It's not the free flow
it's
of the Caribbean.
The free flow thing, no sorry. You know, when we tell you got to end at this time, you got to end at this time, and we tell you got to cut the music off here, and you got to walk. You know, so you got to do that.
It's structured, whereas in the Caribbean, it's basically as much as anything goes.
It's more free form. It's more free form exercise, and this is the big difference. I mean, a number of participants in Labor Day have said for years that they would like the guys here, the authorities here, to understand what that distinction is. But hey, you know, you here, you went in Rome, you got to do as the Romans, man. You know, so that's really the big difference. But in terms of the costuming and all that, although it's not as grand, because just in terms of numbers, I mean, you have bands in Trinidad, for instance, with 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 people.
And this is also a lot shorter. It goes from 9 o'clock, and then by 6 o'clock, we see the trucks coming by and cleaning the street.
That's the kind of regimentation I'm talking about, that you just can't, you know, you're not free to do your own thing as you are back in the islands.
And also, too, here, it's a mixture of different culture. You have the Hades representing Panama, Barbados, all of Jamaica, all of them.
Yeah. But I dare to say that in all of those islands, the same kind of free form thing that happens in Trinidad is what happens, you know, there. You know, and here, you know, you just, as I said, you got to go play the role that these people ask you to play.
That's all we have time for. Les Slater, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic media. From the Amsterdam News, the widow of a probationary firefighter believes the New York Fire Department killed her husband because he's black. Sharita Sears, the wife of the late Jamil Sears, has filed a $10 million wrongful death suit against the city and the FDNY. A witness claims Sears suffered a massive heart attack after he was forced to do brutal training exercises for 2 weeks. Should Con Edison be spending its billion-dollar surplus on installing smart meters in New York City buildings? City Council member Eric Joya thinks so. In an op-ed piece for Caribbean Life, Joya says smart meters can save New Yorkers 10% on their energy bills. Yet, Con Ed hasn't made plans to employ the new technology. Smart meters allow users to monitor their energy consumption more efficiently than conventional meters. From the Haitian Times, community leaders are blasting U.S. officials over an order to deport 30,000 Haitian immigrants. Haitian authorities say they can't handle the return of their countrymen because they're still recovering from the devastation caused by a series of hurricanes. Haitian officials have refused to issue passports needed to process most deportees. From India abroad, the U.S. Senate has passed an amendment to a financial bailout program that will make it harder for companies receiving aid to hire foreign workers. The push to revise the Troubled Assets Relief Program came after the Associated Press reported that dozens of banks requested H-1B visas for over 20,000 foreign workers. Senators who support the rule say companies should look to hire American workers amidst the bleak job market. But experts say the AP article overestimated the use of H-1B visas by such companies. And finally, from the Irish Echo, the horse-drawn carriage industry is pushing to increase fares, and some members of City Council approve. This after the Department of Consumer Affairs rejected a proposal to be rid of the service in New York City. Those are just a few headlines from New York's ethnic media. Back to you, Abby.
Thanks, Zyphus. In his documentary, Soldiers Without Swords, Stanley Nelson chronicles the history of black newspapers in the U.S. To commemorate Black History Month, we talked with Nelson about the historic mission of the black press. Is it relevant today? Are there possibilities for a revival now that we have an African-American president? Anjanette Levert has the interview.
I had done a number of historical films, and as I was doing the films, I found that I would always go to the black press, and and look at the microfilm of black newspapers, and I just became really fascinated by the black press. It seemed like this was another world that, it hadn't been investigated, and that we hear so many times about black people, back in the 1920s, 1930s, and we always hear about them as maids or chauffeurs or menial jobs, but here were black people who were writers and reporters and editors and typesetters and photographers and all those things, and it just seemed like it was a fascinating history that nobody had ever really looked into, and so that's how I started the project. Well, I think that was one of the things that was so fascinating, is because the heyday was gone, and so in a lot of places, the papers still existed as kind of shells of themselves. So people thought they knew about the black press because the papers were still published in their cities, but they weren't what they had been. And there was another story that told how important the black press had been for over a century to African Americans and African American communities all over the country. Well, I think black newspapers functioned as a number of different things. I think one of the first things they were an advocacy press, and I think that's really important to understand, that these were papers that were not just reporting the news, but they were advocating for African American and African American communities, and that is really important. I think it's something that's really missing today. So I think that's one of the most important things that black papers did. But then they did a number of other things. So they anchored black communities. They, if as simple as if there was an ad in a black paper for a store, then you knew as an African American person that you were welcome in that store. They just did a number of things throughout history. I think there's definitely room for advocacy journalism. I think we don't have it in the way we did. I think there's starting to be some advocacy journalism, on the internet, but it's nowhere nearly as popular and nearly as popular kind of across the spectrum of African Americans as the black press was in its heyday. I think we still need it. I mean, I think obviously, black communities haven't achieved parity, are not where they should be, and so we still need an advocacy press, and I think someday we'll have it again. I don't think it'll be black newspapers coming out once a week in every city across the country. It may be on the internet, it may be on TV, who knows what it might be, on some kind of media that we don't even know about yet. But I do think because there's a need for it, we will have it. I think it might. I think one of the things that Obama does is make us all kind of look around and see who's sitting next to us. When the guy up on the podium is black, you can't help but notice a little more that nobody's sitting around in the audience of reporters is black. I think that what happened before now is nobody even thought about it. It wasn't even a thought. I never have thought about myself being a soldier without a sword before. I think I'm a filmmaker. I think I'm trying, I think what's happening in the black community interests me. So I guess so. I mean, I think it's very different from what I do than a print journalist or a journalist who has a deadline, has something out every week does. It takes me a year or more to make a film, so my output is very small. But I think that my heart is in the same place as many of the black journalists from bygone years, yeah.
We'll be right back.
You promised me the world. Is this what you had in mind?
Help EarthShare and its members restore balance to the world. Visit earthshare.org and see what you can do. EarthShare, one environment, one simple way to care for it.
The Caribbean island of Guadeloupe has been a virtual tinderbox over the last few weeks. Residents and French police have clashed during protests centered on the high cost of living on the French dependency, where the unemployment rate is more than 25%. The violence spilled over to Martinique and has sparked a debate over whether these French departments should become independent. Garry Pierre-Pierre sat down with veteran journalist Joel Dreyfuss, who's been blogging about the unrest and the possible implications.
Protests were not violent for a long time. They've been going on for more than a month, and they began as a protest against high prices, a response to the global economic crisis, high gasoline prices, high food prices, and as a result, the protests grew and developed a tremendous broad following, but they called a general strike, and basically for the last month, Guadeloupe has been shut down, schools have been closed, businesses closed, barricades in the street. Very typical French protests if you actually look at it, and if you spend time in France. The unions are very well organized. In the last few days, it became more violent. The French sent hundreds of police to the island to maintain order, and there were some clashes. A union member was killed. No one is sure by whom, but there was some shooting between protesters and the police, so it became more dangerous. And this is the point at which finally Sarkozy stepped into the debate.
Yeah, I mean, initially the government was, besides the police action, remained silent. And then what happened?
They had sent a negotiator, the Minister for Overseas Territories, came over and held a series of negotiations with the protesters. And apparently, depending on who you talk to, the main demand of the protest was a €200 increase in the salaries of the least paid workers. And the protesters believed that he agreed to that demand, went back to France, and then they changed their minds, or they said they never reached an agreement. That led to the violence, feeling they were betrayed. But then after all this happens, President Sarkozy seems to have actually come back and agreed that there will be that $250 monthly pay increase.
Besides the pay increase, were there other demands the organizers wanted?
Well, what came out of the protest that was probably the most alarming was a high degree of racial tension. The French, like in everywhere, always like to pretend they don't have racial problems. But there began a series of protests against the béquets, which is a term they use for the descendants of the old white plantation and slave owners who still dominate the economy in these islands. And they were blamed for many of the high prices that are being charged for products and living. So it became a racial protest. There were chants of, "It's our land, not your land," apparently aimed at these old colonial masters. So the whole thing came out.
Is independence a talk of these protests?
No, they've been very careful to avoid, although some of the leaders of the protests are known as independentists, they've avoided this issue because it's very divisive on these islands. I don't believe, and I think the polls show, that most people in Martinique and Guadeloupe are not interested in independence. There was a small independence movement in the 80s. It set off some bombs. But no, it's not a movement that's widely accepted. There are too many privileges for being French. You can move between Martinique and Guadeloupe and France very freely. In fact, you can work anywhere in the European Union because they're all French citizens. So the advantages they have, the social benefits, welfare benefits, unemployment benefits, all these things that make the living standard in those islands much higher than any of the surrounding Caribbean countries.
Can this lead to a changing of the social structure, or is it too ingrained for it to change anytime soon, or is this just a beginning of a movement of a more egalitarian society in these islands?
Well, one of the most interesting things is that Sarkozy has called for a general assembly in these islands. So he's going to be traveling around in April. They're going to have a series of big meetings to talk about the future of the relationship between the islands and France. I think what's going to happen is a discussion about more open markets, more competition, maybe reducing the power of the old elite that still controls the economy, possibly changing the political relationship and opening the markets to nearby countries. I think Sarkozy has a reputation as a free market person. It's going to be interesting to see if the free market principles get applied to the territories, and also whether the political relationship will change. There was a sense after these protests that the elected political leaders in Martinique and Guadeloupe had very little real clout in France, and that's something that's going to be examined.
Every time trees are destroyed to make paper, we lose something that can't be replaced.
You have the power to stop this.
Insist that the paper you buy is tree-free.
Insist on it.
Help us win the paper campaign.
Caribbean Life's circulation of just over 100,000 makes it the largest Caribbean newspaper in New York. The paper prides itself on being a good news publication, stressing community service rather than horrifying headlines. Zyphus Lebrun has more in this report.
Kenton Kirby has helmed Caribbean Life for most of the paper's 18 years.
Some people think outside that I am the paper.
Actually, Caribbean Life is the largest weekly newspaper circulated to New York's Caribbean community. It's also one of the Courier Life family of newspapers that include Canarsie Digest and Park Slope Courier. They are all owned by Fox's parent company, News Corporation.
The production people are a generic group of folks who do the artwork and all that, and the advertising people. And here, we just take care of the editorial.
News Corporation, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, bought Courier Life in September 2006. The buyout raised the ire of some members of the ethnic press, who saw this as mainstream media's response to losing readership.
Well, I know there's a lot of concern in the general readership and in the whole national press that big media, the fact that big media is buying up a lot of the community newspapers, that it takes away the voice from the people, and that the people who should tell the stories are not telling it. And this has not affected us in that particular way. As a matter of fact, I think the purchase has affected us positively in that we're definitely able to produce a better looking paper.
A paper that is run by a shoestring editorial staff that consists of Kirby and 2 associate editors, Kevin Williams and Tina Felicetti.
It's almost like a daily effort. It's a continuous push here because the fact that we have a limited, minimal staff and all that sort of stuff, we're always on the go with the paper.
Anything from John there lately?
No, he sent a piece, but there wasn't anything attached to it or anything.
Working with such a limited staff has forced Kirby and his team to be innovative in their coverage of news. The "if it bleeds, it leads" credo is not applicable at this paper.
We focus on consumable type of information, things that people can read and can go forward to find whether it's healthcare, what's important in the area of education, immigration. We cover the whole gamut of stuff.
Though Kirby himself describes Caribbean Life as a good newspaper, they still do hard-edged stories.
We have an active viewpoint section, and we pull in the punches in terms of looking at the issues. We try to speak truth to power, so to speak, and I think that we have been able to keep doing the things that has kept the paper in the forefront of the media in this in the community.
Zyphus Lebrun, Independent Sources.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week. In the meantime, be independent-minded.